everybody. How are we today? Fantastic. I don't know, if you're like me, do you ever just finish something and you're like, oh my gosh, that was such a dumb idea, right? Like, am I the only one that like just finishes things and like, that was so dumb, I don't know why I did that? Anybody? Okay, thank you. All right, good. I want to hear it. It's stuff like you're driving somewhere and your GPS tells you to make a certain turn. You're like, I know better. And then you go a different way and all of a sudden you're dead end. And you just think, oh man, that was so dumb. Why did I do that? Or like you insist. I know a great restaurant. I've been looking to try it out. You get there, the food is terrible, the service is slow, and just like, that was a dumb idea. You think you have the inside track on a stock. You're like, hey, I just need a little bit of money, and you get all the money you can, you invest it, you lose your shirt, and you're just thinking, oh my gosh, why did I do this? Such a dumb idea. And here's the thing, a lot of the decisions we make in life that end up being dumb in the end, they're not like life and death, right? Like it's not like, oh man, I was on the precipice of disaster. And like a lot of the mistakes that we make and a lot of the dumb decisions that we do, they're kind of little things. So take this for instance. My wife and I, we bought a house that was a flip, and the front yard was okay. It was like grass in one area, but it was like low water in others. And here's the thing about Jen and I, we don't really care about the environment. So we're like, we want more grass in the front yard. I'm just kidding, we do care about the environment. We just wanted more grass. So for the better part of a couple weeks, I'm digging trenches to expand our irrigation. We're putting up the caution tape because after we put the seed down, like so nobody's walking on our grass. And then the new grass starts to sprout. And it's exciting because, new beginnings, am I right? And I'm just so pumped for like, man, this thing is coming up. But then I start to look at it, and it doesn't look too great. Officially it's the right kind of grass. It's like a fescue, but it's not the right color, and it definitely doesn't look healthy. And not to besmirch the fine people of Home Depot, but their grass seed is like a step above spray painting the dirt green. But even then, I think I'd get a better color. So I don't even know what's better. And this being my first foray into like redoing an irrigation system, I don't know what I'm doing. So like some heads are like too tall, and I hit them with my mower and have to replace them. Come to find out, we didn't have enough valves. So like all the pipe that I put down wasn't even getting enough water pressure. So parts of the yard aren't getting enough water. My favorite is I had one, sprinkler head that I knew, this is too tall, I'm gonna hit it with my mower. So rather than like fixing it, just added more dirt around it. So suddenly I have this random mound in my front yard. And here's the moral of the story. Don't do anything. Just be content with mediocre. Just don't make a dumb decision. Just don't make any decision. Just be okay with whatever things are like and just accept it, because if you try, you're probably not gonna do well, and you're just gonna embarrass yourself in front of the neighbors. Like that's the moral of that story. That's the moral. Here's the thing, we avoid risk. And why do we avoid risk? Because when you look at your track record, you realize you're often wrong. Like, don't start a business. And you know why you shouldn't start a business? Because 23% of them fail in the first year. 45% are dead by year 5. 65% by year 10, and a whopping 75% of businesses have closed their doors by year 15. Don't get married. In California, the divorce rate is 60%. You have a better chance of getting divorced than staying married. Just don't do it. Certainly do not join a gym. Don't join it. 73 to 95% of New Year's resolutions are abandoned within the first couple of weeks. Don't go out on the limb, because the limb can snap, right? Nothing ventured, nothing lost. No, don't say gain, nothing lost, right? Like, that's the point I'm trying to make. We avoid risk. And the reason why we avoid risk is because it is risky. And new things are risk. But this is spiritually dangerous. And here's where this is spiritually dangerous. Because there are new beginnings that you should take and I should take. But those new beginnings, they look like risk. And we're scared of it because we're often wrong. But where it becomes spiritually dangerous is that new beginnings, sometimes they look like risks, but it could just be God asking you to step out in faith. Last week, we started this brand new series, New Beginnings, and what we're doing is we're weaving in a couple different stories. One of which is the Old Testament character that we see in the book of Genesis by the name of Abram, or a little bit later in his story, Abraham, which we'll talk about next week. But we're also telling our story, the story of First Baptist Church. And one of the reasons why I'm telling the story is because we're on the precipice of a new chapter. In fact, for those who missed this announcement, next week I will be announcing a new name for our church. And if you'd like to know, we have a members meeting as soon as the service is over where I want to give you just a sneak peek. So if you're a member of the church and you want to join me in the fellowship hall after, I'd love to be able to give you a sneak peek of the name. But the reason why is because new beginnings, they're not just good for us as a church. The reason why we're talking about this is because new beginnings are good for you. Like even if you're not a Jesus follower, like you're here because you got drugged here by somebody else, or you're seeking things, but you're not 100% sold. You just remove the supernatural aspect of things. You're probably doing things that you shouldn't, and you're probably not doing some of the things that you should. It's like you should look for some new beginnings in your personal, your financial, your relational life. You should actually eat better. And frankly, if you feel led to start that business, start that business. Stop being so unforgiving. Make some progress to be better. New beginnings are good. It's one of the reasons why our imaginations get captivated this time of year as we start to set resolutions, is because as we take an audit and a diagnosis of our past life and like who we were last year and the year before, we often realize there's room for improvement. There's things that we can do. And I would say that God is often pushing you to take that step of faith to live a better year this year than you did last. In fact, God would actually say that it is impossible to please him without faith. Let me put it another way. There's things that he wants you to do that are going to look risky. And they're risky because you don't know the future. You don't know how it's going to play out. Like on a very practical level. Generosity. God asks us to be generous with our money. But giving any amount of money away, it feels like a risk. It's like, what happens if you don't have enough for you? And so it's hard to trust God with giving money away to other people when you don't know if you're going to be taken care of. Or relationships. You risk not knowing a very important part of your life with another person when you choose to say, I'm going to be sexually pure until I am married. Like that is risky. Or when it comes to openness, if you share things about yourself and you risk vulnerability with other people in a group or in another like Christian community setting, you risk them using it against you. But in all of those, God would say that those are good risks to take. And it's not actually a risk, it is faith. But there's another level of this as well. That there is sometimes a more specific leading for you. So like I'll give you another example. When I first started dating Jen, not when I first started, but a little bit later, I knew that this is the person I should spend my life with. It's just the winds of like God's movement in my life. I just knew this is who I need to spend my life with. And I didn't hear an audible voice. I didn't have like a magic verse like pop up in my Bible reading. I just knew this is what I was supposed to do. When Jen and I were praying about moving to San Diego, we felt led to come here. And I know on one hand, it's America's finest city. It's not the hardest thing to say yes to. Until you pull out a calculator and you start doing the math on like, what would it actually take to live here? Right? But we knew that's where God was leading us, and it feels risky, but ultimately it is faith. So last week we started telling you the story of Abram. And his story starts in Genesis 11 in chapter 12. And here's what you need to know if you missed last week. Abram and his wife Sarai, when God gives them this promise that I'll talk about in a second, they are 75 and they are 65 years old. He is 75, she's 65. They have no kids. And it's clear right now that Sarai is barren, that there's no hope of ever having children. And this would have been for her an emotional setback. It would have been a social one as well. And we don't actually have recorded what their inner emotions were like, but there doesn't seem to be an expressed discontent with this lot in life. And in some ways, it almost seems like they're just content with the fact that when we die, our family will die out with us, and that's okay. But then God starts to speak. And he tells Abram, you're going to be the father of a great nation. But in order for that to be true, it would require children. And there was no ambiguity to this promise. It wasn't like a philosophical sense. It was a physical one. God is going to give Abram and Sarai an heir. That's his promise. Now, you got to think that as soon as God starts to reveal this to Abram and Sarai, I mean, just going through what they've been through with 75 and 65 years of feeling in some ways like they were failures. This would have been breathing incredible hope and life into their life. The innermost longings of their heart, like to have a family, God was going to come through. Like, imagine it this way for a second. Imagine in our day and age, you have a couple who has saved dramatically to buy a house. And so they both work, you have a couple, they're both working jobs, they're living in tiny apartments, they're throwing every gift, every overtime hour, every amount of money they can, they're putting into a house fund, hoping that they'd be able to someday afford a down payment. But then one day, one of them gets sick. And they're no longer able to work, and the other one has to cut back on maybe all their extra work and their overtime and the side hustle so they can care for their spouse. And month after month and year after year, that nest egg gets depleted until it is nothing. And they have to live with the reality that that dream of owning a home is no longer. It is dead. But then out of nowhere, that wealthy uncle that they'd kind of forgotten about calls and says, I promise you, I'm going to give you the money for your home. Now, this would be incredibly exciting, right? Like, you had this dream, you felt like it was dead, and now it's there. He's like, I'm going to give you $500,000. You're going to be able to get that down payment. I promise it is coming. But see, here's how it worked for Abram and Sarai. There was a promise. It's almost like, here's the funds, but there's no proof of funds. You have to trust me. Now, this would have been okay, but they have to wait. And you just kind of wonder, like, how long do you start to go before you start asking the questions that we would all ask? Did I mishear God? Because we weren't not talking about days or weeks or months, but they have to wait years. And there's no indication that this is about to change. In fact, this new beginning that's seemingly promised now starts to feel like a burden, as it doesn't look like God's actually going to follow through. So Genesis 15 opens up like this. It says, sometime later. We're nearly 15 years after that first promise. The Lord spoke to Abram in a vision, and he said to him, do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and and your reward will be great. But Abram replied, mark that in your minds. I'm going to get back to it in a minute. O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all of my wealth. What he's explaining is when he dies, there's no like blood heir, so a member of like his servant crew is going to receive that. That was appropriate in their culture. Verse 3, you have given me no descendants of my own, so one of my servants is going to be my heir. Then the Lord said to him, no, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own who will be your heir. Like I said, in chapter 12, there is a promise. But in chapter 15, God is reiterating the promise. And Abram's response is the same one that all of us would ask. How? How are you going to do this? And here's what's really significant. Every other time before this where God is interacting with Abram, it is a one-sided dialogue, where God is talking to Abram and saying, here's what I'm going to do for you. But in chapter 15, Abram speaks back. And he asks the question that we would ask. How? I have no children. My wife and I, we are not getting any younger. In fact, we are way beyond the ability to have children. How are you going to do this? And you just kind of wonder, like, why would God make you wait? What benefit does it serve to cast this vision and this dream for your life and then just silence? waiting, delay. By the time our church reached its 21st anniversary, it had gone from 14 to 250 people. We were in a 700-seat auditorium, and it was known the area over. I found this really interesting. In 1900, we hired a pastor by the name of W.B. Henson. And apparently, he was an incredible speaker. I did a little extra research on it. You can still buy his sermons on Amazon. It's kind of an incredible thing. When he retired in 1926 from the church that he moved to in Portland, apparently he walks down the stage and everybody's like, we're never getting anybody better than this. Let's just rename our church. So they renamed it to the Henson Memorial Church. For me, as a speaker, that's pretty incredible. I do not want that, but what I do think is incredible is that's something that you do for college coaches who win 900 games, right? We're gonna rename the floor. It's now, the Mike Krzyzewski court. That's what you do in that area when you have a legend in your midst. And that was apparently just the shadow that W.B. Henson cast. He was this incredible orator. People came from all over the place. When he was our pastor for 10 years, our church grew from 250 to 750 people. In a day and age when San Diego was not very large, and here's probably more significant, in a day and age where churches did not grow that big. The average church in America in 1900 was probably 40 people. That the largest a church would get, maybe a couple hundred, maybe 300, 400 people. And W.B. Henson, just his incredible oratory skills, comes in and our church starts to explode. And like I was saying before, whenever you have somebody who's a legend like that, they rename the church after you, which is what they did up in Portland. So when he leaves in 1910 to move up to the Pacific Northwest, you would expect the next couple people to come in and really struggle. Because how do you follow a legend? How do you come behind somebody that just everybody loved? But the unthinkable happened. The church continued to grow. And in fact, it continued to grow so much that they're we've outgrown our 700-seat auditorium. We need to think bigger. And they build a third building. In fact, this building, it still stands today. Some of you, if you want, you could move into it because it's been turned into loft apartments. It's called church lofts. It's actually what it looks like right now. But it's still a staple in downtown. It's still a place that people call home. And at the time it was built, it boasted the largest auditorium in the city, 2,000 seats. Once again, that was massive, incredibly large. Our church was home to some of the great leaders and pastors of their day, names like Dr. Geistweet, Dr. Kirtley, Dr. Frank Belden. They saw our church continue to grow and grow, and in 1925, there was a new pastor named John Bunyan Smith. Incredible name, by the way. I don't know, we got to get back to these kind of names. He takes over, and he's instrumental in helping the church go from where it was to where it eventually would go. He gets it healthy financially. He adds staff. And by the time we reach the end of World War II, the membership of our church was 5,000 people. And that's how many people would attend every single week. 5,000 people. Let me put it in this perspective. Now, the jump from 14 people to 250 in its first 21 years is a smaller gap than our current size today, where we're 140 people, to the 5,000 that attended in 1945. Behind the pulpit of First Baptist Church, guest speakers like Billy Sunday, which might not mean a whole lot to you, but in his day, in the first half of the 20th century, this dude was electric. He would speak almost on a circuit throughout the country, and thousands upon thousands. He was a former baseball player. He was animated. He would get up and he would stomp all over the podium. He was one of the premier speakers of his day. I can't even do that. At one point, Billy Graham himself spoke at our church, stood behind our pulpit and spoke to, and if you're not sure who that is, Billy Graham is one of the most influential evangelical leaders, not just in our nation's history, in the world's history, and for all time. Millions upon millions of people have come to faith through the preaching and the influence of Billy Graham. And he was somebody that said, I'm going to speak at the First Baptist Church of San Diego. Our church had an outsized impact on our city. To this day, within our own city, there are generations of people whose lives have been impacted and they don't even know it by the influence of our church. This is the type of church that changes the world. This is the type of ministry that produces leaders that other churches come and say, we want to capture some of the magic that you have. And they start pulling them off to hire them to work at their churches around the world. And it's kind of like Michael Jordan in 1992, or like Patrick Mahomes a couple years ago, Barry Bonds in 2001, where it's like a professional athlete at its absolute apex. But kind of like a professional athlete, there comes a time where the prime years start to disappear. And the story of our church and how we got here to University City is the population and kind of like social trends started to shift. Where at the time when we were at our apex, the population largely lived downtown. And slowly but surely in the post-war years, they started to retreat to the suburbs. You can also imagine a building that was put in place 120 years ago did not anticipate the fact that when people come to church, they'd want to bring a car with them. And so we had a building downtown where there was no parking, and you're trying to find parking on the streets. And so suddenly you have an aging congregation that's moved out to the suburbs that can't drive their car to go to church, and slowly but surely, the thousands who were attending in the 1940s and 1950s started disappearing in the 1960s and 70s. So eventually, First Baptist Church would decide that it was time to relocate from downtown to University City. We merged with First Baptist Church of Claremont. We bought 5.5 acres near the 805 and the 52 freeways. And for the last 46 years, our church has met here. Not necessarily in this building. Half of our time was over in the fellowship hall. Half of our time has been here. And I don't want you to get me wrong. God has still moved in this ministry greatly. A lot of really good things have happened here. If our church never gets above a couple hundred people again, it doesn't invalidate our existence. It doesn't constitute failure. And one of the reasons is because God's economy for success is a lot different than ours, and it doesn't function like ours does. But sometimes I kind of wonder, what if the prayers that were given 50 years ago, 75 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, for God to use First Baptist Church to reach this city, what if they didn't have an expiration date? Like, what if God is still listening and saying, I want to do something with you? Abram was asking the same questions that we would ask too. God, you told me what you were going to do, but you haven't done it yet. I'm not younger. I'm not getting younger. I should be a man with not just children, but grandchildren and maybe great-grandchildren. Am I misunderstanding what you've asked me to do? Because for Abram and Sarai, they were way past their reproductive prime. People in their 80s and their 90s, shocker, they don't have a whole lot of kids. In fact, it's an impossibility. But for God and Abram and Sarah, this was not built on their logic or their feelings. It was built on faith. But unfortunately for them in this moment, they're having to live in the messy middle. They're between the promise and the fulfillment of that promise. And when Abram speaks back to God and says, how are you going to do this? God doesn't say back to Abram, dang it, Abram, just listen to me and trust what I was telling you. He doesn't do that. In fact, he lovingly responds this way. It says in the back half of chapter 15, verse 4. Then the Lord took Abram outside and he said to him, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have. To really understand this, there's a couple different layers to this. One layer is, I think, kind of obvious. You go outside, especially where you don't have light pollution on a clear night, and you see just the countless stars. And it's almost like, yes, just trust me, this is how many descendants you're going to have. But there's another level to this as well, one that I do not want us to miss. In 2024, and for the last couple thousand years, we've had the benefit of Genesis through Revelation, 31,000 verses in the Bible. And not just that, because we've been around for a couple thousand years, you have countless books that expand on those 31,000 verses. Not like new revelation, but like telling us like, hey, here's how you can understand this better, and here's what you can do to really trust in God. We have the stories of God's faithfulness, not just in your own immediate families and like your Christian church, but like 2,000 years of Christian history, of showing how God is faithful to the nth degree. There's so much we can do to boost our confidence in God. I can look at Isaiah, I can look at Psalms, I can look in the Gospels, I can look even in the minor prophets, and I can be encouraged by who God is. What can Abram do? Abram has shown up in chapter 12 of a book that hasn't even been written yet. What is his confidence based in? It's based in what he knows and what God has done in his life. And one of the few things that he really knows about God is in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God points Abram to the skies, not just because the number of the stars, but also as a reminder. God made the stars out of nothing. In the beginning, there was nothing. And God speaks light into the darkness. And it's a pretty big miracle to go from an 80 and 90-year-old person to having kids, right? Like that's a pretty big miracle. But what's the bigger miracle? Taking two humans and having a child, or taking nothing and putting the stars in the sky? This is so much smaller to give you a child and an heir than it was to put them in the sky. In academia, this is called theology. It's just a big fancy word for us, the study of God. And maybe for some of you that sounds painfully boring, but it's something that I want you to see differently. The more you know about God, the more you can trust him. Your faith can be anchored in timeless truth, not just in like, oh, I thought this and I thought it was pretty good. And so just want to tell you about something we're starting here. In the winter this year and in the fall of this year as well, I'm offering an experience to a few of you that are really interested in this called Theology Lab. And the idea is if you've ever want to learn about the core beliefs of what it means to be a Christian, this is it. If you want your faith to be anchored in something that's substantive, like this is what you should do. If you want to know how your faith impacts like very real topics like abortion or world religions, among many other things, like this is the place to learn it. And like I said, I'm only accepting about 12 people in this because it's brand new. But this is something that I would encourage you to think about, because the more you know about God, the more you have confidence in him. And if you look through that group's insert that's in your program, you can see how you can sign up for it. But I believe that the 11 weeks that you would spend in Theology Lab, where it's interactive, it's fun, it would put your faith in hyperdrive. Like it would be something that would just completely change how you see him. But Abram's faith, it was substantiated by what he knew about God. He knew God created the heavens and the earth. He can have more confidence because of that. And the thing is, your confidence will always be rooted, your confidence in God will always be rooted in what you know about him. Now it keeps going. It says in verse 6, and Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith. Then the Lord told him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession. So what does God do? When Abram asks, how are you going to do this? He points him to the skies and says, what do you know about me? But then he also points Abram to his own life and says, what have I already done for you? He reminds him of what he's done for him in the past. He says, I brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans. It was his hometown. Abram trusted God. He gets up and he leaves. And what's on the other side of that obedience? Blessings. What we didn't get a chance to look at is that God has materially blessed Abram tremendously. That at this point, he was a very, very, very wealthy man. just like God said he would be. And so God is saying, you know why you can trust me? Look at the skies. That's what you know about me. But you know how else you can trust me? Look what I've already done. When you stepped out in faith and you trusted me, I came through. It's almost like God is telling Abram, if you're waiting for me to fail, it has not happened yet, and it's never going to happen. Look at my track record. You can trust me. And here's something I would just encourage all of us to do. You need to chronicle God's leading. See, the more you chronicle God's leading, the more you can see his blessings. And I just encourage you need to write these things down. And you have to share them with others. And the reason why is because our memories are only as good as a goldfish. I love my wife. I have incredible memories with my wife. But do you know how easy it is for me to forget the 11 years of incredible memories I have with her and get so annoyed at the things that she does? It's incredibly easy. And partly because, I am not remembering all of the good things. And if that's true in my marriage, I know it's true in my faith. Is that for some of us, we have a what have you done for me recently relationship with God. That he did incredible things 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And you're like, you know what? It doesn't even matter because you haven't done it recently. But you know how you remember these things? You write them down and you share them with others. So maybe theology lab isn't really going to work in your schedule right now. That's okay. But I would highly encourage you, not just encourage you, I'm like a doctor, making a prescription here. You need to join a group. See, when you jump into a group, you suddenly are surrounded by other people that you can share these things, and you are strengthened by your own memories, but also the memories of other people. And suddenly you realize that when I'm living in the messy middle, I need the support of a shared faith. So what happens in Abram's story? It says in verse 9, the Lord told him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Kind of starting off in a weird tone. So Abram presented all these to him and killed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle, and he laid the halves side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half. I'm really glad they gave us that detail. Here's the thing, this doesn't mean a whole lot to you. But 4,000 years ago, when Abram is walking the earth, the way that you would seal an agreement with another person when you're exchanging land or when you're just coming into an agreement is that you would take animals, you would cut them in half, and then the two of you would walk down the middle of the animals. And so what God is essentially doing right here is saying, I'm going to meet you where you're at, Abram. You want to know how serious I am? I know I've promised you. I know I've said this, but let me seal this promise in a way that you're going to fully understand. I'm going to give you a DocuSign, right? I'm going to give you the contract. That's essentially what he's doing. He's like, I'm guaranteeing it for you. So if you wanted one more thing to remember, hold on to this one. In 2022, I felt strongly that God was leading me and Jen to San Diego. We didn't know where. We didn't know what we were going to do. And frankly, I didn't even know First Baptist Church of San Diego existed. I was completely oblivious to its history. In fact, the only reason I found out that this existed is because I applied to work at another church. And when I did that, my resume got put out onto the internet, and I started getting contacted by a million different people. Now, you might think, wow, Matt, you must have been really in demand. No. It was almost like, I'm a little too old for this, but I've heard about guys who go on to Tinder or the dating sites, and they just start matching with every single person they can, just hoping that somebody else will love their ugly face. I was getting the church version of that, where every church is you know what, we don't know anything about them, but you know what, let's just try. If we get enough yeses, or we get enough invitations, somebody will say yes. Some get an invitation to be the secretary at Episcopalian churches in Nebraska, and it's oh, get out of here. But I got this email from an organization called Transformation Ministries, and it really felt like a form email, and I wasn't even going to respond to it. But I got a little curious, so I clicked on their website. And just as it happened, some of my best friends in the city of Ventura were prominently featured on their homepage. And so I'm oh my gosh, if my friends like Neil can be part of this, then maybe this is a good organization. So I make the phone call, and I start talking, and they tell me all about you. And they tell me about Glenn, they tell me about the board, they tell me about the challenges that exist within the church. And I think, man, maybe this is how God is going to fulfill the leading I feel in my life. Because I had this dream, like, what would happen if God had this outsized impact in San Diego again, and he used me at this church to do it? And then in verse 11 of chapter 15, it says this. And I say this because I feel a kinship with Abram in this moment. It says in verse 11, some vultures, they swooped down to eat the carcasses, but Abram chased them away. Immediately after God decides to reiterate his promise to Abram, what happens? The vultures swoop down, and they try and feast on the reminders of the promise. And frankly, this is part of what it looks like to live in the messy middle. Your belief starts getting eroded by the distractions and the doubts of your circumstances. Because I applied, I didn't hear anything for like 6 months. And I'm not saying like, it's just how these things work. And so I'm suddenly like, man, what are we going to do? Where are we going to live? In fact, Jen and I, we felt so strongly that God was leading us to San Diego, but I didn't have a job. But we sold our home in Ventura and we moved down anyway without any kind of promise. And was that faith? I hope so. Was it foolishness? I don't know. But God has honored it. My church that I worked for said, you know what, Matt, we're going to be patient with you. Take as much time as you want. You can commute on the weekends. Like live in San Diego, work here on the weekends. Totally fine. God had a way of providing. And what I'm trying to say is when you step out in faith, it looks so risky. But God will honor it. But in the messy middle, before God has fulfilled his promise, you have to chase the vultures away. And tell them, no, that's God has made this promise. I've seen what he's done. I've seen what he's done in my life. I've seen how he's blessed us. I can look back at the times when he was faithful to my parents. I can look back at the times when he was faithful to me. I can look at the times he was faithful to our church, and I can trust. Those vultures aren't real. And it's hard because, just being transparent with you guys, there's a lot of times when I think about just the challenges that we are up against, just on a church level. I'm like, do I have what it takes? Do I have the ability? Like, are we going to have enough money to do all that we've dreamed of doing? Are we going to have the people to keep a campus like this going? Or the vultures start swooping in, and you have to chase them away. And here's how you chase away the vultures. You have to remind yourself this always. God's past is his prologue. You ever read the prologue of a book? It sets up everything else that's going to happen. And in the story of your life, God's past is his prologue. Who he is and what he has done is the precursor to the miracle he wants to do for you. And frankly, a faith that can't be tested cannot be trusted. He created the heavens and the earth. He moved Abram, and so Abram's like, I can trust you. Every time we've needed God to come through, he has. He has blessed our church's past, and I believe he is not done with us yet. And remind yourself of this. God's delay is not God's disappearance. And just because he hasn't done it yet, it doesn't mean he's not going to do it eventually. God is a God of generations. It's clear now as we read Abram's story, he was setting up a greater miracle. Had he just given Abram and Sarai a child when they were like 25 and 35, there was no miracle there, and there would have been doubts, but to give them a child when they were 190 years old, not 190, but 100, and then she is 90, all right? I'm not going to make the miracle bigger than it's supposed to be. But when he gives a miracle like that, there is no disputing who it came from. And in the messy middle, God was developing Abram's faith and his character, and when the time was right, he was going to move. But until then, Abram had to chase the vultures away. What is God doing in your life that the doubts are trying to steal. Remind yourself, his delay isn't his disappearance. What if God moved First Baptist Church out of downtown in 1979, not because of what he was going to do then, but what he was going to do now? That when the time was right, he was going to gift 5.5 beautiful acres at the corner of the 805 and 52 freeways to our generation to steward it well and to still see an outsized impact within our city. The messy middle, it might look like God has disappeared. But on day 1 and 2 of Jesus within the grave, it looked very similar. It looked like Jesus' death on the cross was not enough. But we know on the 3rd day, he came out victorious. God is a God of resurrections and dramatic movements. On day 3, he breaks free from the bondage of death, and that changes everything. And so because of that, because our God is a God of resurrections, until there's no longer any hope, I'm going to believe that God is not done with us yet. And my hope for you is until God says differently, you're going to believe he's not done with you either. God is on the move. Do not lose heart. His delays are not his disappearance. He's not letting you down. He is setting you up for the very best outcome you can imagine. Let's pray. God, you have been so kind to us. You have blessed us year after year and decade after decade. And God, I am confident that you are not done with us yet. I pray for the future of First Baptist Church, that as we walk boldly into a new season, that God, that you would remind us that our hope is not built on us, it is only built on you. God, I'm praying that we would chase the vultures away until the exact moment when you're ready to move. And that God, that you would keep us encouraged in the meantime. God, I pray for the people here that are sitting in the seat, some of which are going through just terrible sessions of anxiety and hopelessness, thinking that you have left them and that your glory has departed from their life. That God, you would remind them of who you are and what you have done, and that would give them the boost of confidence to proceed forward in the direction that you want them to go. That God, you would remind them you are the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You gave a child to a 90-year-old womb. You can do anything in our lives. God, I pray for those who need to say yes to you for the very first time, that God, you would put this prayer on their lips as they are wrestling with the fact that you're calling them into what feels like a risky step of saying, I'm putting my faith in you. That God, you would put the prayer on their lips of, God, I'm asking you to forgive me of my sins and take full control of my life. I'm yours forever. And God, I'm praying as well that you would continue to add to our number daily those who are being saved, that you would take care of us like you've done in the past, and that you would be our hope. I pray in your name, amen.